The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around the wrists of a man who could authorize an airstrike with a single phone call. The young, arrogant gate guard smirked, utterly convinced he had just apprehended a suspicious trespasser driving a luxury vehicle. He didn't check the military ID in the man's wallet. He didn't notice the disciplined, unyielding posture of the man he was shoving against the hood of the car. And he had absolutely no idea that he had just arrested the new base commander. At 5:15 a.m. on a miserable, rain-soaked Saturday, the sprawling expanse of Fort Bradley was swallowed by a thick, unforgiving fog. It was the kind of morning that chilled you to the bone, where the only people awake were those who had to be. General Samuel T. Henderson preferred it this way. Samuel had spent 32 years in the United States Army. He had commanded battalions in the dusty, treacherous valleys of Afghanistan, coordinated massive logistical movements across Europe, and earned a Silver Star for actions he rarely spoke about. But today marked a different kind of milestone. After months of congressional approvals and endless Pentagon briefings, he was officially taking command of Fort Bradley, one of the largest and most strategically critical military installations in the country. Most incoming commanders arrived with a grand procession. They wore their dress blues, accompanied by an entourage of aides, colonels, and PR officers, rolling through the main gate to the salute of the entire guard detachment. Samuel, however, was a different breed of leader. He despised the dog and pony shows. He believed that if you wanted to know how a base truly functioned, you didn't look at it when it was polished for the general. You looked at it when it thought nobody important was watching. That was why Samuel was driving a rented, unremarkable grey SUV instead of a government-issued vehicle. It was also why he had chosen to wear a faded navy blue Georgetown University hoodie, loose-fitting jeans, and an old baseball cap pulled low over his close-cropped greying hair. He wanted to drive through the gates as an ordinary citizen, grab a cup of terrible coffee from the base exchange, and quietly observe the morning routine of the soldiers he was now responsible for. He navigated the winding, rain-slicked road toward Gate 4. Gate 4 was the installation's easternmost checkpoint, primarily used by civilian contractors, delivery trucks, and lower enlisted personnel living off-post. It was far from the manicured lawns of the main entrance. Inside the guard shack at Gate 4, Officer Wyatt Cooper was having a terrible morning. Cooper was a civilian Department of the Army police officer, a man whose ambition vastly outweighed his competence. He had recently been passed over for a promotion to sergeant, a rejection he blamed entirely on diversity quotas, rather than his own extensive disciplinary record, which included multiple complaints of excessive force and unprofessional conduct. Cooper possessed a bitter, deeply ingrained prejudice that colored every interaction he had. To him, authority wasn't a responsibility. It was a weapon to be wielded against anyone he deemed beneath him. As the headlights of Samuel's rental SUV pierced the fog and rolled up to the stop sign, Cooper sighed loudly, zipped up his high-visibility rain jacket, and stepped out into the downpour. He hated the early shift. He hated the rain. And as he peered through the driver's side window of the approaching vehicle, his eyes narrowed. He saw a black man in his late 50s, dressed in a baggy hoodie, driving a late-model vehicle that Cooper immediately decided the man couldn't afford. Samuel rolled down his window, letting the cold air and the sound of the pouring rain fill the cabin. He had his wallet resting on his thigh, ready to present his Common Access Card, CAC, the military ID that clearly stated his rank of general, bearing the 4 stars that commanded respect across the globe. "Morning, officer," Samuel said, his voice a deep, calm baritone that had commanded attention in war rooms and on battlefields alike. Cooper didn't reply immediately. He rested his hand on his utility belt, right next to his sidearm, and leaned in close to the window, letting his flashlight beam drag aggressively across Samuel's face and the interior of the SUV. The light was blinding, but Samuel didn't flinch. He just blinked slowly, waiting for the guard to finish his theatrical assessment. "Where are you headed at 5 in the morning?" Cooper demanded, his tone entirely devoid of the professional courtesy mandated by Army regulations. "I'm heading to the command headquarters," Samuel replied evenly, picking up his wallet. "I just arrived in town." "Headquarters?" Cooper scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. He leaned closer, the smell of stale coffee and stale cigarettes radiating from his uniform. "Headquarters is closed, buddy. It's Saturday. Nobody is there unless they have high-level clearance. So I'll ask you again, and I suggest you tell me the truth. What is your business on this installation?" Samuel maintained his composure. He had dealt with angry warlords and hostile insurgents. A disgruntled gate guard was not going to break his patience. However, he was mentally taking notes. This was exactly why he did these unannounced spot checks. "I am aware of what day it is, officer," Samuel said, his voice dropping slightly in pitch, carrying a quiet authority. "I have authorization to be there. Here is my identification." Samuel extended his hand, holding out his Department of Defense ID card. But Cooper didn't take it. Instead, his eyes darted to the dashboard, then back to Samuel's face. In Cooper's prejudiced mind, the narrative was already written. A black man in a hoodie, driving an expensive rental car at 5:00 a.m., claiming he needed to go to the base headquarters? It didn't add up. To Cooper, this was either a stolen vehicle, a lost civilian trying to cause trouble, or a contractor trying to steal equipment. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Cooper snapped, shining the flashlight directly into Samuel's eyes again. "Put the ID on the dashboard. Now." Samuel paused. The complete lack of protocol was staggering. A gate guard's job was to take the ID, scan it, verify the credentials, and grant access. Refusing to take the ID was a massive violation of standard operating procedure. Slowly, deliberately, Samuel placed the military ID face down on the dashboard, exactly as instructed. "Officer," Samuel began, his patience beginning to thin, "I recommend you take a close look at that card and scan it. It will clear up this misunderstanding immediately." "I'll tell you what clears up a misunderstanding," Cooper shot back, stepping back and unbuttoning the strap over his holster. "You turning the engine off, dropping the keys out the window and keeping your mouth shut." The rain continued to hammer against the roof of the SUV. Samuel sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting clearly on the top of the steering wheel. He was processing the situation with the tactical precision of a seasoned combat veteran. He could end this right now. He could shout his rank, demand the officer's supervisor, and bring the wrath of the entire chain of command down upon this gate shack. But a deeper, more analytical part of his mind told him to wait. If this was how Officer Cooper treated him, a man who was complying, speaking calmly, and offering valid military identification, how did he treat the young, 19-year-old black and brown privates who came through this gate? How many young soldiers' careers had this man tried to ruin out of sheer malice and prejudice? Samuel decided to let the scenario play out. He wanted to see exactly how far the rot went. He reached forward, turned the ignition off, and tossed the key fob out the window. It clattered onto the wet pavement at Cooper's boots. "Step out of the vehicle!" Cooper barked. "On what grounds, officer?" Samuel asked calmly. "I have provided my identification. I have complied with your instructions. What is your probable cause for ordering me out of my vehicle?" "My probable cause is that you're acting suspicious. You're trying to gain unauthorized access to a restricted military installation, and you're getting smart with a federal officer," Cooper sneered. "Now step out of the car before I drag you out." Samuel unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the door open. He stood up to his full height. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a physique maintained by decades of rigorous military training, Samuel was an imposing figure, Even in a baggy hoodie, the way he carried himself, straight spine, squared shoulders, chin parallel to the ground, screamed military discipline. Any experienced soldier would have instantly recognized the posture of a senior commander. But Cooper wasn't looking at a soldier. He was looking at a stereotype. "Turn around! Hands on the roof of the car! Spread your legs!" Cooper ordered. Samuel turned around and placed his hands flat on the wet roof of the SUV. The cold rain instantly soaked through his sweatshirt. "Officer, I am going to advise you one final time," Samuel said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet, damp morning. "Scan the ID on the dashboard. Call your shift supervisor. If you proceed with this, you are crossing a line that will end your career." "Are you threatening me, boy?" Cooper hissed, closing the distance. The use of the word "boy" hung in the air. Toxic and heavy. Samuel's jaw clenched. The muscles in his forearms tightened. In his 30 years of service, he had bled for his country. He had sent young men and women to die for the freedoms of the nation. To be reduced to a racial slur by a mediocre, power-tripping gate guard on his own installation was a profound insult. Yet his voice remained ice-cold and dangerously calm. "I am stating a fact," Samuel replied. Cooper grabbed Samuel's left arm, yanking it down from the roof with excessive force, intending to unbalance him. But Samuel's core was solid. He didn't budge an inch, which only infuriated Cooper more. "Stop resisting!" Cooper yelled, a textbook phrase used by corrupt officers to justify physical force. "I am not resisting," Samuel stated clearly, keeping his right hand flat on the roof so the dashboard camera on Cooper's patrol vehicle would capture his total compliance. "I'm standing exactly as you instructed." Cooper kicked Samuel's right ankle, forcing his legs wider apart, and then slammed his forearm into the middle of Samuel's back, pressing him hard against the side of the SUV. "You think you're smart?" Cooper muttered into Samuel's ear, his breath hot and unpleasant. "You think you can come onto my base in a stolen car and act like you own the place? I deal with people like you all the time. You're going to spend the weekend in a holding cell, and when the federal magistrate gets in on Monday, you're going to federal prison." "My identification is on the dashboard," Samuel repeated, his face pressed against the cold, wet glass of the window. "It is a Department of Defense Common Access card. It will tell you exactly who I am." "I don't care what your fake ID says," Cooper laughed maliciously. He reached to his belt and pulled out his heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp, metallic zip-click of the handcuffs locking around Samuel's left wrist was loud over the sound of the rain. Cooper aggressively wrenched Samuel's left arm behind his back. It took every ounce of discipline Samuel possessed not to react. Instinct, honed by years of hand-to-hand combat training, screamed at him to pivot, drop his center of gravity, and put the guard on the ground. It would have taken him less than 2 seconds to disarm and disable Cooper. But Samuel was a strategist. He knew that the moment he struck a federal officer, the narrative would change. It would no longer be about a racist cop abusing his power. It would be about a violent altercation. Samuel needed Cooper to hang himself with his own rope. "Right arm behind your back," Cooper commanded. Samuel complied. The second cuff clicked shut. They were too tight, biting into the skin of his wrists. But Samuel didn't complain. "You are under arrest for trespassing on a federal installation, failure to obey a lawful order, and resisting arrest," Cooper recited, sounding immensely satisfied with himself. He grabbed Samuel by the back of his hoodie and roughly marched him away from the SUV toward the small, illuminated guard shack. Inside the shack, another guard, a young private first class named Miller, was watching the interaction with wide, terrified eyes. Miller had been on the force for exactly 3 weeks. He knew something was terribly wrong with how Cooper was handling the situation. But Cooper was his senior, and Miller was too intimidated to intervene. "Open the holding bench," Cooper yelled through the door. Miller scrambled to open the side door of the shack, where a metal bench with an iron restraint ring was bolted to the floor. Cooper shoved Samuel inside, forcing him to sit on the cold metal bench, and attached a secondary chain from Samuel's handcuffs to the iron ring on the wall. "Sit there and shut up," Cooper spat. Samuel sat in silence. Rainwater dripped from his baseball cap, down his face, and soaked into his Georgetown hoodie. He looked around the small guard shack. He noted the messy desk, the half-eaten donuts, the unfiled visitor logs. The lack of discipline was systemic. Cooper strutted over to the desk, grabbed a radio microphone, and keyed it. "Dispatch, this is Gate 4. I have one male in custody, trespassing, resisting. Need a transport unit to take him to the PMO, Provost Marshal Office, holding cells. Copy Gate 4, dispatch crackled back. Transport unit is en route, ETA 10 minutes. Cooper looked over at Samuel and smirked. 10 minutes, pal, then you're going into the system. Let's see how tough you act in a federal holding cell. Samuel simply looked at him, his dark eyes unblinking. Did you look at my ID yet, officer? Cooper rolled his eyes, genuinely annoyed by the man's persistence. Miller, Cooper barked at the young private. Go out to that stolen Mercedes, get the fake ID off the dashboard, and run it through the DBID scanner so we can add possession of forged federal documents to this guy's charges. Yes, officer, Miller stammered. He grabbed his rain jacket and scurried out into the downpour. While Miller was gone, Cooper poured himself a cup of coffee from a thermos, leaning against the counter, clearly enjoying his perceived victory. You guys never learn, Cooper muttered, taking a sip. Always trying to game the system. Always thinking the rules don't apply to you. Who exactly is you guys? Samuel asked softly. Cooper just smiled, a nasty, knowing smile. Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. A minute later, the door to the guard shack flew open. Private Miller stumbled inside. He was dripping wet, but his face was completely devoid of color. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. In his trembling right hand, he held Samuel's common access card. Cooper, Miller whispered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. Cooper, you need to look at this. Just scan the damn thing, Miller. Cooper sighed, not looking up from his coffee. No, Cooper, you don't understand. Miller stepped forward, his eyes darting frantically between the ID card and the man handcuffed to the metal bench. He extended the card toward Cooper. Look at the rank. Look at the name. Annoyed, Cooper snatched the ID card from the young private's hand. He wiped the raindrops off the plastic surface with his thumb and squinted at it under the harsh fluorescent lights of the guard shack. First, his eyes went to the photo. It was undeniably the man sitting on the bench. Then, his eyes moved to the pay grade box. It didn't say civilian. It didn't say contractor. It said, O-10 horse. Cooper's brow furrowed. O-10. That was the military pay grade for a 4-star general. Finally, Cooper's eyes drifted up to the name printed in bold black letters beneath the Department of Defense header. Henderson Samuel T. General, USA. Cooper's breath hitched in his throat. The coffee cup in his left hand began to tremble. His mind raced, trying to find a reason why this was a fake, a prank, a misunderstanding. But the card had the embedded gold microchip, the holographic DoD seals, and the unmistakable, pristine formatting of a genuine military identification card. At that exact moment, the heavy hum of a military Humvee engine cut through the sound of the rain outside. Headlights swept across the windows of the guard shack as a vehicle pulled up sharply behind Samuel's rented SUV. The door of the Humvee opened, and Sergeant First Class William Bates stepped out. Bates was the shift supervisor for the military police that morning. He was a seasoned veteran, a man who ran his shifts with strict adherence to regulations. He had heard the radio call for a transport unit and decided to drive down to Gate 4 himself, knowing Cooper's track record of escalating situations unnecessarily. Bates walked into the guard shack, shaking off the rain. "Cooper, what the hell is going on here? Why are you calling for a transport unit?" Bates stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto the man handcuffed to the metal bench in the corner. Though Samuel was wearing a wet hoodie and a baseball cap, Sergeant Bates had attended the mandatory briefings all week. He had seen the official portrait. He had read the biography. He knew exactly who was scheduled to assume command of Fort Bradley on Monday morning. Bates's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked from Samuel to the handcuffs, to the chain bolting him to the wall, and finally to Officer Cooper, who was standing paralyzed with the ID card in his hand. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Sergeant Bates snapped to the position of attention, his heels clicking together so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. He snapped a textbook, razor-sharp salute. "General Henderson, sir!" Bates barked, his voice laced with absolute panic. Samuel remained seated. He didn't smile. He didn't show an ounce of vindication. He simply looked at the trembling Officer Cooper, whose face had just drained of every drop of arrogant blood. "Good morning, Sergeant," Samuel replied calmly. "It seems your gate guard and I have had a slight disagreement regarding my authorization to enter my base." Sergeant First Class William Bates stood completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second, his mind struggling to process the impossible catastrophe unfolding in front of him. The man shackled to the restraint ring was General Samuel T. Henderson. Bates had spent the entire week reviewing security protocols for the incoming commander's arrival, ensuring every MP on the installation knew the general's face, his vehicle plates, and his schedule. And here he was, locked to a metal bench like a common vagrant, dripping wet in a rented SUV. Bates's paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of sheer, unadulterated panic. He lunged toward Officer Wyatt Cooper. "Give me the keys," Bates hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of rage and fear. "Give me the keys right now, Cooper." Cooper, whose face had gone a sickening shade of ash gray, fumbled blindly at his utility belt. His arrogant swagger had vanished entirely, replaced by the jerky, uncoordinated movements of a man who realized he had just stepped on a landmine. His fingers slipped on the metal key ring. He finally yanked the handcuff keys free and held them out. Bates snatched the keys from Cooper's trembling hand and practically shoved the civilian officer out of the way. He dropped to one knee beside the metal bench, his hands shaking as he inserted the small key into the heavy steel cuffs. "General Henderson, sir, I cannot begin to apologize," Bates stammered, the key struggling to find the mechanism because of how tight Cooper had fastened them. "I don't know what happened here, sir, but this is—" "Focus on the lock, Sergeant," Samuel interrupted. His voice was not elevated. It wasn't laced with rage or indignation. It was perfectly level, which somehow made it infinitely more intimidating. It was the voice of a man accustomed to bringing order to chaos. Click, zip, the first cuff released. Bates scrambled to unlock the chain connecting the second cuff to the wall ring, then freed Samuel's right wrist. Deep, angry red indentations circled both of the general's wrists. The metal had bitten into the skin, but Samuel didn't rub them. He simply lowered his arms, rolled his shoulders once, and stood up. At 6'2", standing in the cramped, brightly lit guard shack, Samuel seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. He looked down at Bates, who was now standing at rigid attention, eyes locked straight ahead. "What is your name, Sergeant?" Samuel asked. "Sergeant First Class William Bates, sir. Shift Supervisor, Military Police Detachment." "At ease, Sergeant Bates," Samuel said. He slowly turned his gaze toward Wyatt Cooper. Cooper was backed against the small kitchenette counter of the guard shack. He looked like a cornered animal. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically from Bates to the door, to the four-star general he had just physically assaulted. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him in suffocating waves. You didn't just arrest a 4-star general. You didn't rough them up. Generals of this caliber answered directly to the Pentagon, to the Secretary of Defense, to the President. They were institutions unto themselves. General, Cooper choked out, his voice cracking. I didn't know. You weren't in uniform. You were driving a rental. The protocol. Do not speak to me, Samuel commanded. The words were spoken softly, but they struck Cooper like a physical blow. The guard's mouth snapped shut. Samuel turned back to Bates. Sergeant, I am officially assuming command of Fort Bradley as of this exact moment. These are my first direct orders to you. You will execute them immediately and without hesitation. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Bates replied, his posture impossibly straight. First, Samuel said, pointing a finger at Cooper, relieve this man of his weapon. Now. Bates didn't hesitate. He stepped toward Cooper, unfastening the thumb brake on his own holster, just in case the panicked guard did something stupid. Hands away from your belt, Cooper. Do it now, Bates ordered. Cooper raised his trembling hands. Bates swiftly unclipped Cooper's duty belt, letting the heavy rig, containing the Glock 19 sidearm, the taser, and the pepper spray, drop to the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. He kicked it behind him. Second, Samuel continued, his dark eyes never leaving Cooper's pale face. You will secure the dash camera footage from his patrol vehicle and the body camera footage from his vest. You will lock it down. If a single frame of that footage goes missing or is corrupted, I will hold you personally responsible. It will be secured immediately, sir, Bates confirmed. Third, Samuel said, contact your provost marshal. I don't care if he is asleep. I don't care if he is on leave. You will wake him up, and you will tell him to report to Gate 4 in 15 minutes. If he is late, he will be looking for a new career path on Monday morning. Bates grabbed the heavy radio from his shoulder strap. Dispatch, this is Unit 1. Contact Colonel Grant. Tell him it is a code red emergency at Gate 4. The new base commander requires his presence immediately. As Bates communicated with dispatch, the silence in the room returned, heavy and suffocating. The young private who had fetched the ID was standing frozen by the door, staring at Samuel with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Cooper couldn't take the silence. The panic was overriding his self-preservation instincts. He needed to explain. He needed to justify his actions, to somehow twist the narrative so he wasn't entirely at fault. Sir, respectfully, Cooper stammered, stepping forward slightly. You have to understand my position. We have security protocols. We get people trying to breach the gate all the time. You didn't look like... the hoodie, the early hour. It was suspicious behavior. I was doing my job. I was protecting the installation. Samuel slowly turned to face Cooper entirely. The general stepped forward, closing the distance until he was mere inches from the disgraced guard. Samuel looked down at him, the height difference suddenly feeling like a chasm. Protecting the installation? Samuel repeated, his tone dangerously quiet. Let us be perfectly clear, Officer Cooper. You did not follow a single security protocol this morning. When I presented my identification, you refused to accept it. When I complied with your orders, you used unnecessary physical force. You did not scan my card. You did not verify my credentials. You made an immediate, prejudicial assessment based entirely on my race and my attire. Cooper swallowed hard. Sir, no, that's not... I have commanded troops in 3 different combat zones, Samuel continued, cutting him off effortlessly. I have dealt with enemies of the state who possessed more honor and discipline than I witnessed from you today. You looked at a black man in a hoodie and decided, before I ever rolled down my window, that I was a criminal. You weaponized your badge. You used this uniform not to protect, but to subjugate. Samuel leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried more fury than a scream ever could. You thought you were arresting a nobody. You thought you could abuse an ordinary citizen and get away with it because you had a badge and a gun. But you didn't arrest a nobody today, Cooper. You arrested the man who owns this base. And I am going to make an example out of you. Cooper's knees practically buckled. He grabbed the edge of the counter to keep himself upright. He realized with crushing certainty that this wasn't just a reprimand. This wasn't a suspension. This was the end of his freedom. 14 minutes later, a black government-issued SUV came tearing down the slick road toward Gate 4, its red and blue grille lights strobing violently through the heavy fog and rain. The vehicle didn't even park properly. It slammed to a halt at an angle, blocking the entire incoming lane. Colonel Jonathan Grant, the Provost Marshal of Fort Bradley, threw open the door and sprinted through the downpour toward the guard shack. He was half-dressed in his uniform, having clearly thrown it on in a dead panic. His combat boots were untied, and his uniform jacket was unzipped, but the silver eagle of a full colonel gleamed on his chest. Grant burst through the door of the guard shack, out of breath, rain pouring off his bald head. He took one look at the room. Sergeant Bates, standing guard over a disarmed Cooper, the young private pressed against the wall, and General Henderson, standing calmly in the center of the room in his wet civilian clothes. Grant snapped a salute so hard he nearly pulled a muscle. "General Henderson, sir. Colonel Grant, Provost Marshal. Sir, I don't even have the words." Samuel returned the salute with a slow, deliberate motion. "Good morning, Colonel. I trust Sergeant Bates briefed you on the situation?" "He gave me the outline, sir," Grant said, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He turned a lethal glare toward Cooper. "I am profoundly sorry, General. This is entirely unacceptable. This officer's actions do not reflect the standards of the military police on this installation. They reflect the reality of what happens at your gates when you aren't looking, Colonel," Samuel corrected sharply. "This man is under your command. His conduct is a direct reflection of your leadership and your oversight. We will have a very long, very detailed conversation about the systemic failures in your department on Monday morning at 0800 hours. Be in my office. Bring your training logs and your disciplinary records." "Yes, sir," Grant swallowed hard. "Understood, sir. But right now," Samuel said, gesturing toward Cooper, "we have an immediate issue to resolve. This man illegally detained me, assaulted me, and attempted to charge me with federal crimes to cover up his own incompetence and racial profiling." Grant turned fully toward Cooper. The colonel was a career military cop, a man who despised dirty badges more than anything else in the world. "Officer Cooper," Grant growled, stepping into the man's personal space, "you are officially terminated from employment with the Department of the Army, effective immediately." Sergeant Bates read him his rights. Cooper let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. "Colonel, please, shut your mouth!" Grant roared, his voice shaking the small windows of the shack. "You put your hands on a 4-star general. You violated his civil rights. You are lucky I don't drag you out into the rain and beat you myself." Bates stepped forward, pulling a pair of standard-issue military handcuffs from his belt. Ironically, the exact same make and model Cooper had used on Samuel. "Wyatt Cooper," Bates recited clearly, grabbing the man's arms and forcing them behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Bates secured the cuffs, tightly but within regulation, and finished reading the Miranda rights, Samuel watched with cold, analytical detachment. He felt no joy in this. He only felt a grim satisfaction that a dangerous man was being removed from a position of power. How many ordinary civilians had suffered under Cooper's authority? How many young soldiers had their weekends ruined, their records stained, or their bodies bruised because this man enjoyed hurting people? "Take him to the detention center," Samuel ordered Colonel Grant. Process him for assault on a federal officer, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations under color of law. I want the federal magistrate in my office on Monday to sign the formal charging documents. It will be done exactly as you say, General, Grant affirmed. Bates grabbed Cooper by the bicep. The former guard was weeping now, silent tears mixing with the sweat on his face. All of his false bravado had evaporated. He was just a small, cowardly man facing the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. Bates marched him out into the rain, shoving him into the back of the very MP cruiser that Cooper had proudly summoned to transport his prisoner. With Cooper gone, the atmosphere in the guard shack shifted. The oppressive tension lifted slightly, leaving behind the stark reality of the aftermath. Samuel turned his attention to the young private who had been standing silently by the door the entire time. The kid couldn't have been more than 19 years old. He looked terrified, expecting to be the next one fired and arrested. "Private," Samuel said gently, his tone softening for the first time that morning. The private jumped, snapping to attention. "Yes, sir. Private First Class Lewis, sir." "Relax, Private Lewis," Samuel said. He walked over to the desk, picked up his common access card, and slid it back into his wallet. "How long have you been assigned to this gate?" "3 weeks, sir," Lewis answered, his voice barely a squeak. "Did you agree with how Officer Cooper handled the situation this morning?" Samuel asked. Lewis hesitated. He looked at Colonel Grant, then back at the general. "No, sir, I didn't." "Then why didn't you intervene?" Samuel asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, a teaching moment from a commander to a subordinate. Lewis looked down at his boots, shame coloring his cheeks. "He outranked me, sir. He's been here for years. I was scared to tell him he was wrong. I thought I would get in trouble." Samuel nodded slowly. He understood the paralyzing fear of the chain of command, especially for a brand new soldier. "Private Lewis, courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right in spite of it. Rank doesn't give anyone the right to break the law, and it certainly does not give them the right to abuse others. If you see a wrong being committed, regardless of who is committing it, it is your duty to stop it. If you fail to speak up, you become complicit in their tyranny. Do you understand?" "Yes, General," Lewis said, looking up, his eyes shining with a new understanding. "I understand, sir. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't," Samuel said. He turned back to Colonel Grant. "Colonel, I expect a full written report on my desk by tomorrow evening. I want a complete audit of every arrest and detainment Officer Cooper has made in the last 5 years. If he has done this before, we are going to find the victims, and we are going to make it right." "I will put a team on it immediately, General," Grant promised. Samuel walked over to the door of the guard shack. He looked out into the pouring rain. His rental SUV was still sitting there, idling quietly, the door hanging open. His morning of quiet observation had been entirely derailed, but he had learned more about Fort Bradley in the last 30 minutes than he would have in a month of official briefings. He pulled his soaked Georgetown hoodie tighter around himself and stepped out into the storm. He bent down, picked up his key fob from a puddle on the pavement, and climbed back into the driver's seat. As he shifted the car into drive, Colonel Grant and Private Lewis stood in the doorway of the guard shack, rendering sharp, respectful salutes. General Samuel T. Henderson drove through Gate 4, the heavy tires of his SUV cutting through the standing water on the asphalt. He was finally on his base, and there was a lot of work to do. By 07:45 hours on Monday morning, the storm that had battered Fort Bradley over the weekend had broken, leaving behind a crisp, cloudless sky. Inside the commanding general's suite on the top floor of the headquarters building, the atmosphere was as cold and clear as the weather outside. General Samuel T. Henderson stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the parade field. He was no longer the anonymous man in the wet Georgetown hoodie. Today, he wore his pristine army service uniform. The 4 silver stars on his epaulets gleamed under the recessed lighting, and the rows of ribbons on his chest told the story of a man who had survived the most dangerous environments on Earth. At exactly 0800 hours, a sharp knock echoed through the heavy oak door. "Enter," Samuel said, not turning away from the window. Colonel Jonathan Grant walked in, carrying a massive, 4-inch-thick black binder. Behind him walked a woman in a sharp grey pantsuit, Federal Magistrate Judge Sarah Jennings, a no-nonsense jurist who handled federal crimes committed on the military installation. "General," Colonel Grant said, coming to rigid attention. "The Provost Marshal's office reports as ordered. I've brought Judge Jennings to review the charging documents, as requested." Samuel finally turned. "Good morning, Colonel. Judge Jennings, thank you for making the time. When I get a call at 6 on a Sunday evening that a base police officer handcuffed a 4-star general, I tend to clear my calendar." "General," Judge Jennings replied, her tone a mix of disbelief and professional gravity. She set her briefcase on the large mahogany conference table. "I reviewed the dashcam and bodycam footage you sent over. It is, without a doubt, one of the most egregious abuses of authority under color of law I have seen in my tenure." "It gets worse, Your Honor," Grant said grimly, setting the heavy binder on the table with a loud thud. Samuel stepped toward the table, his eyes locking onto the binder. "What did you find, Colonel?" "We spent the last 48 hours running a complete audit of Officer Wyatt Cooper's arrest record, traffic citations, and use-of-force reports over the last 5 years," Grant explained, opening the binder. "The data is sickening. Cooper disproportionately targeted black and Hispanic motorists at a rate of 4 to 1 compared to white motorists. But more than that, we found a pattern of manufactured charges." Grant pulled out a specific file folder and slid it toward Samuel. "Take the case of Hector Ramirez, a civilian HVAC contractor," Grant continued. 4 months ago, Cooper pulled Ramirez over at Gate 4 for suspicious behavior. Ramirez didn't speak perfect English and got confused by Cooper's aggressive commands. Cooper dragged him out of his work van, slammed him onto the asphalt, and charged him with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Ramirez lost his security clearance, lost his business contract with the Department of Defense, and nearly went to prison. He only avoided jail time because he pleaded out to a lesser misdemeanor. Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked at the photograph of Ramirez in the file, a hard-working man whose livelihood had been destroyed by a predator with a badge. "And there are more like this?" "Dozens, sir," Grant said, his voice laced with disgust. "Minorities, lower enlisted privates who didn't know their rights, civilian contractors. Cooper preyed on anyone he perceived as vulnerable or unable to fight back." Samuel closed the folder. "A pattern of this magnitude does not happen in a vacuum, Colonel Grant. A patrol officer cannot ruin dozens of lives over 5 years without someone higher up the chain of command looking the other way. Who was reviewing and approving his arrest reports?" The twist of the knife in Grant's expression was evident. The colonel looked genuinely sick to his stomach. "That is the hardest part of this report, General. Cooper's direct shift supervisor changed frequently, but his precinct commander, the man who signed off on every single use-of-force report and internal affairs complaint, was Captain Timothy Gallagher." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Captain Gallagher, bring him in." "He's waiting in the anteroom, sir," Grant said. "Judge Jennings," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. "I suggest you have your pen ready. We are about to add a co-conspirator to those federal charges." Colonel Grant walked to the door, opened it, and barked, "Captain Gallagher, get in here!" Captain Timothy Gallagher marched into the room. He was a tall, sharply dressed officer who exuded the kind of smooth, political confidence that often masked incompetence. Gallagher snapped a salute to General Henderson, entirely unaware of the trap he had just walked into. He assumed this was a standard meet and greet with the new base commander. "General Henderson, sir." Gallagher smiled smoothly. "An honor to meet you. Welcome to Fort Bradley." "Drop the salute, Captain," Samuel ordered softly. "Take a seat." Gallagher's smile faltered slightly at the icy reception, but he complied, sitting stiffly in one of the leather chairs opposite the commander's desk. He glanced at Colonel Grant and Judge Jennings, finally sensing that the temperature in the room was entirely hostile. "Captain Gallagher," Samuel began, pacing slowly behind his desk. "On Saturday morning, one of your civilian officers, Wyatt Cooper, unlawfully detained me, assaulted me, and attempted to charge me with federal crimes. He did this while I was in civilian clothes, despite my full compliance and presentation of a Department of Defense ID. Gallagher's face drained of color. He had heard rumors over the weekend about a massive incident at Gate 4, but the details had been locked down by CID, Criminal Investigation Division. He had no idea the victim was the new base commander. "Sir General, I am appalled," Gallagher stammered, his polished demeanor shattering instantly. "Cooper has always been a bit aggressive, but I had no idea he was capable of—" "Do not lie to me in my own office, Captain," Samuel interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip. He picked up the heavy black binder and slammed it down on the table directly in front of Gallagher. The resounding bang made the captain flinch. "You knew exactly what he was capable of," Samuel stated, leaning over the table, bringing his face uncomfortably close to Gallagher's. "Because you signed off on it, every single time. You signed the use of force report when he beat Hector Ramirez. You dismissed the internal affairs complaint when he harassed Private First Class Jackson. You rubber-stamped a 5-year campaign of racial profiling and civil rights abuses." Gallagher began to sweat profusely. "General, you have to understand the volume of paperwork I deal with. I command a precinct of 50 officers. I can't thoroughly investigate every minor complaint. I have to trust my men." "Trust?" Samuel asked, standing up straight. "You call it trust? The Department of Justice calls it complicity. You provided cover for a predator because you were too lazy, too indifferent, or too prejudiced yourself to do your damn job." Samuel turned to the magistrate. "Judge Jennings, based on the audit provided by the Provost Marshal, do we have sufficient grounds for federal indictment?" Judge Jennings adjusted her glasses and looked at Gallagher with absolute contempt. "General, based on this audit, I will be forwarding Captain Gallagher's files to the FBI Civil Rights Division. At a minimum, he is looking at federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, official misconduct, and conspiracy to commit perjury." Gallagher panicked. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "General, please. I have 20 years in the service. I'm up for major next month. You can't let a civilian court take me down for administrative oversights." "Administrative oversights," Samuel repeated, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "You destroyed lives, Gallagher. You betrayed the uniform. And as of this second, you no longer wear it." Samuel looked at Colonel Grant. "Colonel, strip him of his command. Confiscate his weapon, his badge, and his clearance. Escort him to the CID holding facility to await federal arraignment. And if he speaks another word in my office, add insubordination to his charge sheet." "With pleasure, sir," Grant growled, stepping forward and grabbing Gallagher firmly by the arm. News of the Monday morning massacre in the commanding general's office spread through Fort Bradley like wildfire. By noon, everyone on the installation knew that Officer Wyatt Cooper and Captain Timothy Gallagher were sitting in federal holding cells, facing decades in federal prison. The shockwaves were absolute. For years, a culture of quiet intimidation and unchecked authority had festered at the gates and in the precinct houses. In a single morning, General Samuel T. Henderson had ripped it out by the roots. At 1400 hours, Samuel called for an all-hands formation of the military police detachment and the civilian guard force in the base auditorium. 500 men and women sat in dead silence as the four-star general walked onto the stage. There was no podium, there was no microphone. Samuel didn't need them. His presence alone commanded the vast room. "By now you have all heard what happened at Gate 4 on Saturday morning," Samuel began, his voice projecting clearly to the very back row. "You know that one of your own put a four-star general in handcuffs. But I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I am not angry because Wyatt Cooper disrespected my rank. I am angry because Wyatt Cooper disrespected this uniform and the citizens he was sworn to protect." Samuel paced slowly across the stage, making eye contact with the officers in the front rows. "Power is a privilege," Samuel continued. "When you put on a badge, when you carry a firearm on this installation, you are granted the authority to enforce the law. But the moment you use that authority to feed your own ego, to exercise your own prejudices, or to bully those who cannot fight back, you become an enemy to everything the United States Army stands for." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent crowd. Wyatt Cooper thought he was arresting an anonymous black man in a hoodie. He thought nobody would care. And that is the true tragedy of this situation. He felt safe in his corruption, because, for 5 years, this department let him feel safe. Samuel pointed a finger toward the center of the room. "That ends today. Every single arrest report, every use of force incident, every complaint filed in the last decade is going to be reviewed by an independent federal task force. If you have abused your authority, we will find you. If you have covered for someone who abused their authority, we will find you. You will lose your badge, and you will go to prison." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Nobody dared to breathe. "But," Samuel's voice softened slightly, "I also know that the actions of a corrupt few do not represent the honor of the many. On Saturday morning, I saw corruption, yes, but I also saw a young private, only 3 weeks out of training, who knew that what he was witnessing was wrong." Samuel looked toward the front row. "Private First Class Lewis, stand up." Lewis, trembling slightly in his dress uniform, stood up and snapped to attention. Private Lewis was afraid, Samuel told the crowd. He was intimidated by a senior officer. But when confronted with the truth, he did not lie. He did not cover for his superior. He stood in the gap. That is the foundation of integrity. Samuel rendered a sharp salute to the young private. Lewis, tears welling in his eyes, returned the salute. "Take your seat, Private," Samuel said. He turned back to the center of the room. "We are the defenders of this nation. We do not prey on the weak. We protect them." Dismissed. As the auditorium emptied, the atmosphere was forever changed. The culture of fear had been broken, replaced by a stark, uncompromising standard of accountability. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky over Fort Bradley in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Samuel sat at his desk. He was signing the official reinstatement and back pay orders for Hector Ramirez and a dozen other victims of Cooper's malicious profiling. The base was quiet. The gates were functioning properly. The predators had been locked away, and the uniform meant something honorable once again. Samuel T. Henderson picked up his pen, signed the final document, and looked out his window. The storm was finally over. If this story of justice, accountability, and the swift dismantling of corruption resonated with you, you are not alone. True leadership isn't about demanding respect for a rank. It's about protecting the vulnerable and holding those in power to the highest possible standard. General Henderson proved that integrity means doing the right thing, especially when no one is looking. Do you think more leaders need to take this kind of hands-on, uncompromising approach to corruption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please like this video, share it with your friends to spread this powerful message, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories of justice.